I never thought my life could unravel in a single instant. One moment, I believed Ryan and I had a solid 9-year marriage built on trust, shared dreams, and joint struggles. The next, everything I knew felt like a lie meticulously crafted around me. It all started with business trips. At first, they seemed normal. Ryan's career in pharmaceutical sales demanded travel. But when I noticed a $12,500 charge on our joint card and he flew off to yet another conference, something in me stirred. I need to understand this, I whispered to myself, though part of me feared the answer. I worked long, exhausting hours, 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. And yet, as I sifted through our records, I found inconsistencies that made my stomach churn. Cities that didn't exist on her itinerary, hotel bills that didn't match the conferences she claimed to attend. And then, the charges, luxury spa packages, private dinners, premium services, all tied to my shared finances. My hands shook as I realized the truth. Ryan wasn't just cheating emotionally. There were tangible, deliberate efforts to deceive me, to fund secret escapades. I confronted him, heart pounding, hoping for an explanation, for some shred of honesty, and was met with the same manipulation he'd perfected over months. Tears, gaslighting, blame, the accusation that I was suffocating him with my concerns. I stared at the stack of travel receipts, the screenshots, the hotel statements, and I felt my world collapse. Months? No, a year of lies. Not only had Ryan hidden affairs, but he'd also trained me to feel guilty for asking questions about money we earned together. My own home, my shared life, had been weaponized against me. And yet, in that moment of betrayal, a spark ignited. I realized something crucial. The story wasn't about what I had lost. It was about reclaiming my truth. I had choices. I could crumble under the weight of his deception, or I could rise, gather evidence, and confront the full scale of his betrayal. I didn't know how far this would go, or how much it would change me, but I knew one thing. The life I thought I had was gone, and the journey to reclaim myself was just beginning. I was 34 when all of this came crashing down, and I thought I had it all figured out. I worked as a warehouse supervisor at a medical supply company. Long hours, hard work, but steady pay. I liked the rhythm of my job, the sense of accomplishment at the end of a 10-hour shift, knowing I had provided for myself and contributed to something tangible. Ryan, on the other hand, was 36, a pharmaceutical sales representative, ambitious, charming, and always on the move. We met at a networking event nearly a decade ago. I remember it vividly. He was leaning against a table, laughing at something someone said, and I caught his gaze. There was an immediate connection, that spark that makes you believe life just shifted direction. Over the next few months, we dated carefully, thoughtfully, building a relationship that felt both exciting and grounded. He was attentive, funny, and protective. I was cautious, independent, yet eager to trust him. The early years of our relationship were a dance of compromise and discovery. We celebrated career wins together, took small trips to unwind, and slowly intertwined our lives. Our families were involved in our courtship. His parents were warm but occasionally judgmental, reminding me subtly of expectations and boundaries I needed to respect. I always made an effort to accommodate them, understanding that family dynamics could make or break a marriage. When we married, 9 years ago, I felt like I was stepping into a partnership built on mutual respect. We shared finances, decisions, dreams. Ryan often traveled for work, but it never felt invasive. He always told me about his trips, where he was going, who he'd meet. I trusted him completely. Looking back now, there were little signs I ignored. A slight hesitation when asked about a weekend away, vague explanations for unusual expenses, subtle defensiveness if I inquired about details. At the time, I brushed them off. Love makes you forgive the minor inconsistencies, convinces you that your trust is justified. I never imagined those small cracks would widen into a canyon that swallowed everything we had built. Our home life was comforting, if sometimes hectic. Ryan had a demanding schedule, and I tried to balance my own work while managing our household. Dinner conversations, weekend errands, occasional movie nights, simple routines that anchored us. I loved how he smiled when he shared stories about clients, how he praised my achievements, how we celebrated the little victories together. Friends often commented on how solid we seemed. "You two are perfect for each other," they'd say. I believed them. I believed in us. I even defended him when his family occasionally hinted at pressure or disagreements, smoothing over tensions quietly, always thinking the best of him. But now, all those years of trust and routine feel like a fragile facade. The life I thought was secure, the man I thought I knew, the home I believed in, they were all part of a carefully curated illusion. And as I sifted through every receipt, every statement, every hotel record, I realized that the Ryan I loved might have existed only in my memory. I didn't know then how far his deception went or how deeply it would affect me. All I knew was that the foundation of my life had shifted beneath me, and I had to brace myself for the storm that was coming. At first, the tension was almost imperceptible, like a low hum in the background of our daily lives. Ryan's travel schedule had increased. What used to be a single trip every few months became 2 or 3 a month. He insisted it was all part of pushing for a promotion, and I wanted to believe him. After all, I had always admired his drive, his ambition, the way he threw himself into his career with total commitment. But then came the little things that gnawed at the corners of my mind. The phone that buzzed constantly, hidden just slightly out of view when I entered the room, the vague explanations for receipts I hadn't recognized. "It's just a client lunch," he'd say. "Nothing to worry about." I tried to take him at his word, but my intuition whispered otherwise. Even his friends began to act strangely around me. I noticed it in subtle ways. A sudden quiet when I entered the room, hurried changes of topic, a glance exchanged that didn't include me. It was nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and accuse him of. But the feeling of being subtly shut out, the quiet undercurrent of exclusion, made me increasingly uneasy. His family, too, started adding pressure, albeit unintentionally. Conversations that once felt neutral began to carry a weight of expectation. "You're so lucky to have Ryan," his mother said one evening over dinner. "He's so busy with work, and you understand him so well. Not everyone could manage that." At the time, I smiled politely, but inside I felt a flicker of irritation. Was it just admiration, or were they implying that I needed to tolerate more than I thought reasonable? The household atmosphere began to shift. I noticed the small inconsistencies in his stories, hotel locations that didn't quite match, meeting schedules that felt overly detailed in one breath, but vague in the next. I tried to ignore them, telling myself I was overreacting, letting paranoia creep in. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I found myself replaying moments in my head, trying to connect dots I hadn't noticed before. The way he sometimes avoided eye contact when I asked about expenses, the sighs, the tiny frustrations, the defensiveness that flared over trivial questions. I questioned myself. Was I being controlling, too suspicious, or was my instinct actually picking up on the first whispers of betrayal? There were nights when I would lie awake, heart racing, imagining scenarios I didn't want to confront. The mental back and forth became exhausting. I found myself analyzing every text, every call, every meeting he mentioned, trying to see through a fog I couldn't yet name. And yet Ryan was still charming, still loving when he wanted to be. It was maddening, the mix of affection and subtle evasion, the warmth and the hidden distance. That duality kept me tethered, constantly questioning my own judgment. I began to see the pattern. Little excuses, small lies, just enough defensiveness to mask a bigger truth. My gut screamed at me that I was standing on the edge of something catastrophic, but I had no proof. The seed of conflict had been planted, and it was growing quietly, imperceptibly, like roots twisting beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. It was the tension in these quiet, unremarkable moments that prepared me for the shock that was coming. Before the storm could fully break, I had to confront the unease, the suspicion, the subtle betrayals that were piling up, because soon there would be no ignoring the truth. The moment I discovered the truth is seared into my memory, a crystal clear snapshot of shock, disbelief, and the sudden collapse of the life I thought I knew. It began with what I assumed was a mundane task, preparing our financial records for tax season. Ryan was away on yet another conference, this one in Phoenix, or so he said. I logged into his company portal to download travel statements, expecting the usual business expenses and hotel confirmations. What I found instead made my stomach drop. Not a single hotel matched the cities he'd told me he'd visited. The July Chicago conference? Atlanta? The September Dallas client meetings? Nashville. Every trip for the past 6 months had been a lie. And the hotel charges weren't just for rooms. Couples spa packages, romantic dinners, late-night room service for two, charges that clearly weren't business-related, all billed to our shared account. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, heart pounding, hands trembling as I scrolled through the statements. I kept asking myself, am I reading this right? It didn't make sense. How could someone I loved and trusted so completely orchestrate a deception, so intricate, so methodical? Then came the charges for Luxury Concierge LLC, high-end escort services, and premium memberships on sugar daddy websites. $4,000 of our joint money, spent without my knowledge, without a word. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was tangible, calculated, and cold. Ryan had been living a double life, and for months, maybe even a year, he had manipulated me into questioning my own judgment while funding his indiscretions with our shared finances. When he returned from his Phoenix conference, hotel records showed Denver, I confronted him immediately. My hands were still shaking and my voice trembled despite my efforts to stay calm. Ryan, we need to talk, now. I have everything printed out, every trip, every charge. I know where you really were. He froze, just for a fraction of a second, and then, like clockwork, the act began. Tears, apologies, the familiar gaslighting. You violated my privacy, he said. I feel suffocated. Why are you monitoring everything I do? My stomach turned. I wasn't monitoring. I was uncovering a year of lies. But his words were precise, practiced, designed to make me doubt my own sanity. I held up the stack of documents. Every single trip, every single charge, every hotel. None of it matches what you told me. Ryan, I know you've been lying. I know about the escort services. I know about the sugar daddy accounts. I don't understand why. He looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and defensiveness. I was under so much pressure. You wouldn't understand, he said, voice shaking, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't try to deny the charges, only the context. Pressure, I thought. This is deliberate deception, manipulation, betrayal. For the first time, I truly saw him. Not the charming, ambitious man I had married, but someone willing to dismantle our marriage, our trust, our shared life, to serve his own desires. The mix of hurt and anger was overwhelming, a wave crashing over me. I felt dizzy, nauseous, my chest tight, as if the air itself had thickened. I told him then, with as much control as I could muster through the storm of emotions, you have 24 hours to leave. I'm filing for divorce. No counseling, no second chances. You've shown who you really are. Even as I said the words, I felt the weight of the world pressing down. His family was going to be furious. Friends would take sides. But nothing could undo the years of deception, the months of gaslighting, the calculated betrayal. And yet, amid the horror and disbelief, a strange clarity emerged. I understood that the life I had known, the 9 years of love, routines, and shared dreams, was irrevocably gone. And in that understanding, I found the first flicker of control, the first glimmer of power in a situation designed to strip me of both. The storm had arrived, and I, trembling, heart racing, but resolute, realized that surviving it would demand every ounce of strength I had, and then some. The hours after that confrontation felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and yet every corner seemed to echo Ryan's deception. I wandered from room to room, my mind replaying every interaction over the past year, every subtle evasion, every defensive word that I had brushed off as fatigue or stress. I couldn't cry. The betrayal was too sharp, too precise, cutting through every layer of trust I had built. Instead, I felt an icy clarity settle over me. Questions swirled endlessly. How did I not see this? Was I really so blind? Did I ever truly know him? I felt both anger and grief, tangled together like thorny vines wrapping around my heart. I sat at the kitchen table, hands gripping the edge, staring at the stack of printed statements and hotel receipts. Each page was a testament to his deceit, a trail of lies that spanned months, a meticulous record of manipulation. I thought about the times I had apologized for asking questions about our finances, how I had been gaslighted into believing I was controlling, overbearing, even paranoid. And now the truth was undeniable. A part of me wanted to lash out, to scream at him until my throat ached, but I knew that wouldn't restore anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal. Instead, I tried to process the emotions logically, to map out what I needed to do next. I reminded myself this was not about revenge. It was about clarity, justice, and reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me. I replayed the confrontation in my mind. His tears, his excuses, his insistence that I wouldn't understand the pressure he'd been under. Every word was a calculated attempt to redirect blame, to make me question my perception. And yet, even as I recognized the manipulation, a tiny, stubborn part of me mourned the man I thought I knew. The Ryan who had laughed with me, held my hand through difficult times, shared dreams for the future. That Ryan was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Late that evening, I called Ryland, a coworker and friend who had experienced something similar. His voice was calm but firm. "Lucy," he said, "the lying is bad enough. But the gaslighting, that's what really eats you alive. He's trained you to apologize for asking basic questions about your shared life. That's psychological manipulation. You're not controlling for wanting transparency. You're not unforgiving for refusing to accept systematic lies. You're human, and you've been treated unfairly." Hearing his words was like breathing after being underwater for too long. I nodded silently, tears finally slipping down my cheeks. The floodgates opened, and I allowed myself to feel the weight of betrayal fully. Anger, grief, frustration, disbelief, all mingling together. But even in that moment of despair, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let the manipulation continue to define me. I began documenting everything meticulously: hotel receipts, credit card statements, corporate travel records. I printed every line, every transaction, every email that contradicted the story Ryan had told. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but necessary. I had to see the full picture before I could decide my next steps. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of control. Ryan's deceit had taken many things from me: trust, intimacy, the sense of security. But it hadn't taken my agency. I was still capable of thinking clearly, of making decisions, of reclaiming my life. By the end of that night, after hours of sorting, cross-referencing, and shaking with emotion, I made a vow to myself. I would not be gaslighted any longer. I would not let years of love and trust be twisted into justification for betrayal, and I would confront the full extent of the truth, no matter how painful. I went to bed exhausted, body tense, mind racing. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of distorted realities and imagined confrontations. Yet, beneath the turmoil, a quiet determination had begun to take root. I would survive this. I would expose the truth, and I would emerge stronger on the other side. The days that followed Ryan's confrontation felt like walking through a storm that refused to break. I thought the hardest part was discovering his betrayal, but I quickly realized the storm had many layers, and some of them came from the people around him. His family, convinced that reconciliation was the only path, became relentless in their efforts to guilt me. His mother called, her voice trembling with faux concern. "Lucy, don't throw away 9 years over a rough patch. Marriages require work. Surely you can forgive and rebuild." I listened, silently gripping the phone, nails pressing into my palms. Forgive? Rebuild? Did they even understand what 9 months, or a year, of lies, manipulation, and financial deception felt like? I wanted to scream that this wasn't a rough patch. This was a carefully orchestrated betrayal, one that had systematically stripped me of trust while making me doubt my own judgment. His sister, Mira, was worse. She showed up unannounced one afternoon, holding a folder she claimed contained Ryan's side of the story. I didn't want to see it, but curiosity gnawed at me. Mira's version painted a very different picture. Ryan, a victim of emotional neglect, had only sought connection elsewhere to cope with loneliness and stress. According to her, I was overbearing, controlling, suffocating, the villain in a story he supposedly didn't want to be part of. I stared at her, fury and disbelief warring in my chest. So months of deception, stolen money, and secret trips, none of that matters? I asked. My voice was low, shaking with rage. It's just me being suffocating? She hesitated, then said softly, "You don't understand. He felt trapped. He was under pressure. Pressure. That word hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to choke on it. This was deliberate, planned, calculated. Pressure doesn't justify lies, manipulation, or betrayal. And the pressure didn't stop there. Friends and acquaintances began asking questions, taking sides based on partial information. Ryan must have had reasons, they said. Relationships are complicated. Maybe you were too strict about finances. The gaslighting I had endured at home spilled into the world outside, and suddenly I felt the isolation of being surrounded by people who didn't see the truth. Amid all this, I dove deeper into evidence. Every hotel receipt, every travel expense, every luxury charge, spa treatments, romantic dinners, late-night services was cataloged meticulously. I discovered he had opened a separate bank account 6 months prior, funneling money from our joint savings, small amounts at a time, until nearly $8,000 was diverted. Small enough to escape immediate notice, large enough to fund his hidden life. I cross-referenced everything with the timeline of his supposed business trips. The pattern was crystal clear. Every Monday, a new conference was announced. Every Tuesday through Friday, money was moved, charges incurred, details fabricated. By Sunday, Ryan returned home with stories rehearsed to the letter. It wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a systematic, calculated deception. The pressure from his family and friends only intensified as I began confronting him with this mounting evidence. Calls, messages, and occasional in-person confrontations became arenas for emotional manipulation. Ryan wept, apologized, and redirected blame with the precision of someone who had practiced this for months. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," he said. "If you hadn't made me feel monitored, none of this would have happened." I started to see a pattern. Every defensive word, every tear, every excuse was a shield. He was attempting to control the narrative, painting me as unreasonable, overreactive, and emotionally rigid. Even as I knew the truth, the gaslighting was relentless. My own instincts were questioned, my emotional reactions scrutinized, and my grief reframed as overreaction. Yet, amid this escalation, something inside me began to harden. I had cataloged, cross-referenced, and verified everything. The evidence was undeniable, and slowly, a strategy formed in my mind. I wasn't just surviving this storm. I was preparing to confront it with clarity and precision. I also realized that the longer I delayed, the more opportunities he had to manipulate those around him. Friends, family, even colleagues might believe his carefully spun narrative if left unchecked. I needed to act decisively, with documentation, logic, and unwavering conviction. By the end of the week, I had prepared a complete dossier: hotel records, travel itineraries, expense reports, credit card statements, and screenshots of his online activity. Each piece corroborated the others, forming an unassailable record of deception, manipulation, and financial misconduct. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was resolute. I would no longer allow guilt, pressure, or manipulation to dictate my choices. The escalation had reached its peak, but it also illuminated something vital. I had the evidence, I had the clarity, and most importantly, I had the strength to reclaim my life. The betrayal was massive, but so was my resolve. And as I stared at the neatly organized piles of truth, I felt the first flicker of empowerment after months of emotional turbulence. Despite the meticulous evidence I had gathered, the nights were the hardest. Darkness seemed to seep into every corner of my mind, amplifying the pain and isolation. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage echoing with the ghost of trust I had lost. I replayed every memory, every laugh, every tender moment, twisting them in my mind. Was any of it real? Or had he been performing for me the entire time? The thought was suffocating. I remembered the nights he returned from conferences with stories of networking dinners, productive meetings, new accounts. I had praised him, celebrated him, even admired his dedication. All the while he had been lying to me, spending our shared money on indulgences that had nothing to do with business. I felt betrayed on every level, emotionally, financially, psychologically. The gaslighting had been so effective that I doubted myself for months. I questioned every instinct, every suspicion, every conversation I had once thought of as grounded in reality. And now, even armed with undeniable evidence, I felt the crushing weight of despair. I could barely look at the phone without anxiety clawing at me. Each call from Ryan's sister, each text from his mother, was like salt on an open wound. They insisted I see the bigger picture, pressured me to forgive, to rebuild, to work through a rough patch. But this wasn't a rough patch. This was a calculated, deliberate dismantling of our marriage, and no amount of emotional pleading could change that. Alone, I questioned everything about myself. Had I been too trusting, too naive, too forgiving? My reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger staring back at me, eyes shadowed with hurt, face drawn, hands trembling. I felt trapped in a paradox. I knew the truth, yet I was haunted by the pervasive narrative others were trying to impose, that I was the problem, the unforgiving one. Financially, the damage was staggering. Between secret hotel stays, escort services, luxury dinners, and spa treatments, Ryan had siphoned off over $15,000 of our joint money. Then there was the separate account he had been funneling savings into, nearly $8,000, quietly disappearing while I was made to feel guilty for asking simple questions. I had been living with someone who systematically betrayed me while making me apologize for wanting transparency. I sat on the edge of the bed one night, staring at the floor, and whispered to myself, how could anyone be capable of this? How did I not see it sooner? The tears came in silent, burning streams, hot and relentless. I felt completely alone. Every ounce of trust I had placed in someone I loved, someone I had shared my life with, had been shattered. Even my attempts at seeking support were complicated by manipulation. Friends, acquaintances, and even extended family seemed to tiptoe around the situation, unsure of how to respond, or worse, echoing Ryan's carefully crafted narrative. I felt trapped in a maze of doubt, grief, and rage. There was no escape, no immediate validation, only the relentless pulse of heartbreak. And yet, in that dark hour, something unexpected began to stir. The pain was immense, but so was the clarity. I realized that while Ryan had stolen trust, intimacy, and a sense of security, he had not yet touched my resolve. He could not dictate my next steps, could not control my choices, could not define who I would become. The abyss felt bottomless, and for a moment, I imagined giving in to despair. But then I thought of every injustice I had endured, the lies, the financial manipulation, the gaslighting, and a spark of defiance flickered. I would not let his actions erase my dignity, my voice, or my life. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the betrayal, to mourn the marriage I had thought was solid, to grieve the man I had loved. But amid the tears, amid the exhaustion and helplessness, I began to see the faint outline of a path forward, a way to reclaim my life, my agency, and my sense of self-worth. That night, lying awake, heart heavy, I made a silent vow. I would rise from this, not through revenge or anger, but through clarity, strength, and decisive action. The storm was far from over, but I was beginning to see the first glimmers of light beyond the darkness. The turning point didn't arrive with a grand revelation or dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. I was going through Ryan's financial records again, cross-referencing his hotel stays, credit card charges, and corporate travel statements. Each line of data was a dagger, but it was also a map, a meticulous trail he had left behind without realizing I would see it in full. That's when I found it. A series of small but significant transactions linking his separate bank account to several recurring luxury service charges, all neatly labeled in his own handwriting in the online statements. The pattern was undeniable, the planning meticulous. This wasn't a fleeting mistake or an emotional lapse. It was a deliberate exit strategy, calculated over months while simultaneously manipulating me into apologizing for asking legitimate questions about our shared finances. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, a strange clarity settling over me. The betrayal was massive, yes, but now it was tangible, documented, undeniable. I had the truth in my hands, and with it came a power I hadn't felt since discovering the lies, the ability to act decisively, I remembered Ryland's words from weeks ago. You're not controlling for wanting transparency. You're not unforgiving for refusing to accept systematic lies. It resonated deeply now, cutting through the fog of guilt and doubt that Ryan and his family had so carefully cultivated. I realized that my anger, grief, and disbelief were justified, and more importantly, that I had the right to act on them. I decided then and there, I would not let Ryan's manipulation continue. I would confront the truth openly, but I would do so on my terms, calmly, with evidence in hand, without the cloud of emotional coercion. I started drafting a timeline of his deception, documenting every fake conference, every misrepresented location, every financial irregularity. The more I compiled, the more empowered I felt. The victim narrative that Ryan and his family had tried to impose on me began to crumble under the weight of facts. A mutual friend, someone I trusted completely, reached out around this time. She had noticed the tension, the distance growing between Ryan and me, and offered perspective without judgment. Sitting across from her in the quiet of my apartment, I spoke freely, laying out the events, the charges, the deception. She listened, her expression empathetic but firm. "You've done everything right," she said. "You've documented, cross-checked, and kept your composure. You are not overreacting. You are seeing clearly what he refuses to admit to himself." Her words were like a lifeline, anchoring me amidst the swirling storm. For the first time in months, I felt validation. Not from Ryan, not from his family, not from anyone who had tried to gaslight me, but from someone who understood the full picture and recognized the injustice I had endured. By the evening, I felt a shift. The dark, oppressive weight that had consumed me in the days following my discovery had lifted just enough to reveal a path forward. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was planning. I would proceed with the divorce, yes, but I would do so with clarity, with precision, and with unassailable evidence. I would protect my assets, my reputation, and my emotional well-being. And most importantly, I would no longer allow Ryan to define the narrative of my life. I began drafting a plan. How to approach the divorce, how to present evidence, how to insulate myself from the manipulations of his family. Every step was deliberate, every decision grounded in logic and truth. The emotional haze that had clouded my judgment for so long was clearing, replaced by resolve and strategic thinking. That night, as I sat alone with the evidence spread across the dining table, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: control. For the first time since discovering Ryan's betrayal, I was no longer a passive participant in the drama he had orchestrated. I was the one shaping the next chapter. I realized something else, quietly but profoundly. My value was not defined by someone else's betrayal. My strength was not measured by their perception of me. I had survived the lies, the manipulation, the gaslighting, and I had emerged with clarity and purpose. The turning point wasn't just about exposing Ryan's deceit. It was about reclaiming myself, asserting my worth, and refusing to allow anyone to undermine my reality. And in that moment, I knew I was ready. Ready to confront the consequences, ready to cut ties with the deception, and ready to walk away, not as a victim, but as someone who had survived, learned, and grown stronger. The fallout was swift, inevitable, and, finally, satisfying in its clarity. I filed for divorce the following week, armed with the dossier I had painstakingly compiled. Every hotel receipt, credit card statement, bank transfer, and travel record was meticulously organized, leaving no room for doubt. Ryan's previous attempts at gaslighting, his calculated deflections, and his tearful manipulations were rendered irrelevant against the stark, undeniable facts. His family's calls became frantic, pleading, even angry. His mother's voice cracked as she said, "Lucy, you're throwing away 9 years. Don't you care about reconciliation?" I listened calmly, letting each word wash over me without reaction. I had already weighed the emotional and financial implications, and I knew that nothing she said could change the truth. Miera tried a more direct approach, showing up with Ryan in tow, hoping to convince me to reconsider. But when confronted with the evidence, their arguments collapsed like fragile paper under pressure. I presented the travel records, the mismatched hotel stays, the luxury services charges, the separate bank account. Ryan attempted to explain, to cry, to insist that I was misinterpreting research and exploring options, but it was futile. Facts finally had the upper hand. Friends who had previously questioned my reactions began to see the pattern as clearly as I had. The whispers of overreacting and too controlling faded as the truth came to light. Those who had doubted me quietly acknowledged that my actions had been measured, precise, and justified. The social narrative Ryan had tried to control slipped through his fingers. Financially, the fallout was concrete. The court ordered Ryan to repay the funds he had siphoned into his private account, along with the amounts spent on luxury services unrelated to work. Our joint assets were largely preserved, and while he retained certain personal property, the majority of our shared wealth remained intact. The meticulous documentation ensured that there was no room for dispute, no loophole he could exploit. Emotionally, I felt a profound release. The months of tension, doubt, and manipulation had taken a toll, but the act of asserting my boundaries and presenting the truth gave me a sense of agency I hadn't felt in a long time. I was no longer a passive participant in Ryan's deception. I had reclaimed control over my narrative, my finances, and my emotional well-being. The most remarkable part of the fallout was witnessing the unraveling of Ryan's carefully constructed image. Colleagues who had admired his dedication were confronted with the stark reality of his duplicity. Friends who had been unaware of the manipulation began to distance themselves, unwilling to align with someone who had orchestrated such systematic betrayal. Even his attempts to frame himself as a victim of emotional neglect crumbled under the weight of documentation and testimony. I moved out of the home that had become a silent witness to betrayal and manipulation, choosing a smaller apartment closer to work. The space, though modest, felt like a sanctuary, a place to rebuild, to reflect, and to reclaim the peace that had been eroded over months of deceit. I redecorated, unpacked, and allowed myself to settle into a new rhythm, free from the shadows of manipulation that had once dominated every corner of my life. Throughout this period, I maintained contact with Ryland and a few trusted friends who provided steady support and perspective. Their presence reinforced the reality that I was not alone, that my reactions were valid, and that my choice to leave was both reasonable and necessary. Ryan, for his part, retreated into a narrative of victimhood among those still willing to listen, but the court proceedings and documented evidence had stripped much of his credibility away. No amount of tearful explanations or appeals to emotion could undo the clarity of facts, and he faced the social and legal consequences of his actions squarely. As the dust settled, I allowed myself moments of quiet reflection. The betrayal had been devastating, the manipulation sophisticated, and the emotional toll immense. Yet, in confronting the truth and asserting my boundaries, I had rediscovered a fundamental truth about myself: resilience. I had been wronged, yes, but I had also acted decisively, preserved my dignity, and emerged stronger. By the end of the process, I could finally walk away without bitterness, without regret, and without lingering fear. The fallout was complete, not just in terms of legal and financial resolution, but in reclaiming my life from someone who had tried to control it through deception. I had survived the storm, and in doing so, I had discovered the depth of my own strength. The first morning in my new apartment, sunlight spilled across the floorboards, warming the space in a way it never had in our old home. For the first time in months, I breathed without the shadow of betrayal pressing down on me. I made myself coffee, sat by the window, and let myself simply exist. No lies, no gaslighting, no manipulation, just me. Looking back, the entire ordeal had been painful beyond words, yet it left me with profound clarity. I had learned that love should never come at the cost of self-respect, that trust is sacred, and that deception, especially when systematic and deliberate, is unforgivable. I realized that standing up for myself was not cruel, it was necessary. Walking away from someone who had spent months orchestrating lies was not weakness, it was strength. I spent time reflecting on the lessons, both practical and emotional. Transparency in relationships is non-negotiable, and accountability is not optional. I understood now that my intuition, which had been questioning Ryan's behavior long before the evidence surfaced, was a gift. Trust your instincts, I reminded myself, because no one else can feel your reality for you. As weeks turned into months, I allowed myself to heal, not by revisiting the past, but by building a life grounded in my values, my independence, and my integrity. Work became a refuge, friends became anchors, and I embraced the freedom to make decisions without fear or manipulation. The pain remained, but it no longer defined me. I had reclaimed my narrative, and with it, a sense of empowerment I hadn't known I possessed. To anyone watching this story unfold, the takeaway is clear. Never let guilt, manipulation, or the weight of someone else's deceit dictate your choices. Walking away can be an act of courage, not surrender. Protect your truth, document carefully, and trust your judgment. Some betrayals cannot be forgiven through counseling or compromise. They can only be met with clarity, boundaries, and decisive action. In the end, I was not broken by Ryan's lies. I was strengthened by the process of uncovering them and asserting my boundaries. 9 years of marriage could not define the rest of my life. I had been tested, I had been deceived, and yet I emerged with dignity intact, lessons learned, and the courage to trust again on my own terms. The sun rose higher outside my window, and I felt it, a quiet, resilient hope. Life was waiting, honest and untainted, and I was ready to step forward, fully aware that some endings are necessary beginnings.